We have a nice hour together, which is really exciting. I am not going to go through and introduce everybody one by one. They're going to introduce themselves as part of our opening question. But first, I just want to say welcome. And my name is Sarah Buffie. I'm from Soulbird Consulting, and I get the privilege of being a consultant on the Resilience Project, which that's where this training is coming from, or this session is coming from today, hosted by the Resilience Project. So what we are doing today is we have a panel discussion ready for you. Of folks who have completed the 3rd annual Trauma Informed Biographical Timeline Cohort. So we started a couple years ago through the Resilience Project with our first cohort down in the southwest part of the state, and then we opened that up to a larger audience. We met in Columbus the next year from folks from all over. And then we had, of course, our virtual year this last year where we engaged online in this online space, but still had a really great participation and turnout and engagement in the process. So we've got facilitators and participants here for the panel to talk about their experience. Not just what is a timeline, but what has the cohort process meant to them? What has it been like for them as professionals and just as human people? But we're going to get in those questions in a minute. I do want to name, just before we dive too much further, what is a trauma-informed biographical timeline? I was introduced to learning from people's biographies way back in the day when I used to work at Starfire, and we learned about Beth Barrell's work, Beth Barrell and Herb Lovett, who talked about the importance of context, historical context, as we're understanding a person. And of course, one of my mentors, Joe Krippenstapel, used this lens and process on how to really shifting people from an institutional setting into homes, community, and home life, and understanding where people had come from and what they'd experienced was just a really important part in bridging the gap between a segregated setting into a more home setting. Of course, Mary Vicario and Maureen Walker added the trauma-informed and then trauma-responsive lens to the trauma-informed biographical timeline, and it's how we use it today in the Resilience Project. And a lot of folks who are familiar with the process, we talk a lot about it's not the product that we're talking about here, but it's the process that really brings the storytelling and the story listening of someone's life really to life in that experience. So really the framework allows us to look at someone's current situation in context of their life experiences. And we start to uncover who is this person? What is the resilience they've experienced? What are the challenges and traumatic events or experiences that were in their life that they've overcome? And then we look at who is this person? What do they need? And what will it take to meet those needs? It's a really helpful framework to get us all on the same page and having a good relational dialogue about how we can support. So that's the cliff notes to what is a trauma-informed biographical timeline. But what we want to do is really get into kind of the what of not just of the timeline, but in the cohort. And what I'd like to do is invite my co-facilitator, Shanda Sugg from Labors of Love. You've got some great ways of describing what the timeline process has meant to you and what you learned from it. So maybe I'll invite you to introduce yourself. Who are you? Give us a little bit of background, and then if you could lean into one of your quotes that I think is really helpful. I'm not going to steal your thunder, but we'll hear what your thought is around the timeline, and then we'll keep shifting around the room here.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Buffy. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shanda Sugg, and I am a trauma specializing family therapist and a training consultant. So I work with multi-generational families, helping them to actually address the trauma that usually gets ignored, swept under the rug, or otherwise put somewhere not in the forefront of family relationships. I also think it's important to recognize that I use the term family loosely. For me, that doesn't have to do with biology or shared DNA, but relationships. So if you got a business partner, you're a family. You sing in a choir, family. In a band, family. Live in a cul-de-sac. I just moved in a cul-de-sac. I realized we're going to be family. We just kind of stare at each other all day, right? So family. I help people work through family things. And then I train. You name it, I'll train you. Law enforcement organizations, schools, whatever. about what is trauma. So that's who I am. I'm also a mom and a partner and a wife and all those wonderful things. And the Trauma Informed Biographical Timeline has been super important to my work. And essentially, when we're looking at the timeline, we're trying to understand how a person came to be who they are. What I have found is that what comes out of a person makes 100% sense if you understand what went into them. And as service providers, we are culturalized and socialized and organized to hone in on the output of a person, what they say, what they do, what they don't say, what they don't do, wrap a story around it, and then try to fix it. And what the trauma timeline does is it allows us to go, wait, before I start addressing what's coming out of the person, I need to have intimate understanding of what went into a person. And that has to do with the beliefs, the worldviews, and the behavioral patterns that they've developed over time to survive their family structures and their social systems. And so that is what the timeline does. It allows us to see a person for all that they are, not just what they do and don't do.
Shanda, with that, which I think is such a powerful way of looking at this as a process, what's your experience been with the cohort and kind of bringing people into this journey in a different way?
You know, what I appreciated so much about being a part of the cohort and being a co-facilitator of the cohort is taking people who come in with the perspective of, I have a job to do, and here's what I'm going to do for those that I serve, and really helping the people go, oh wait, I'm a person too. And so kind of my role, unofficially and officially, as part of the facilitator team, is not just to, because the timeline itself makes the people we serve human. I make the people doing the job human. I remind them of their humanity. I cultivate the space for them to go like, oh wait, I'm getting activated because I got things that I haven't addressed, because I have things that have impacted me that I haven't realized. And what I appreciate about the cohort is we cultivated space for both. Mm-hmm. That people could both walk away feeling equipped to do timelines, but most importantly for me is I needed people to live the essence of a timeline. Mm-hmm. I needed people to lean in with curiosity and compassion, not just for the people whose name is on that piece of paper, but for themselves and every other person sitting in that space. And so that's what it's been to me, an opportunity to really cultivate space for people to learn that they too get to be human in this social service providing place that we find ourselves. And I think it's a gift to me, and I think it was a gift to a lot of other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. I think that's one of the things we try to emphasize and want to remember. This isn't necessarily a learning journey where we're packing in all the trauma knowledge, right? There are tons of great resources out there. Mary Viccario's trauma responsive care certification to the Tri-State Trauma Network is a great resource to get to the what of the timeline information. Also, what we focus on in the timeline was about how, right? How to engage, the art of facilitation, the dance that happens between self and others. And so, Dr. Kennedy, if you would kind of join with your voice here. We know your presence is here, but if you could share a little bit about who you are. And of course, you were kind of our behind the scenes host, helping us run the Slack channel and keeping us more logistically organized. But you also have looked at the timeline with a different lens. You've used it to look at a whole system. So if you would mind sharing a bit about that, it'd be great.
Sure. Thank you. I am Dr. Adrienne Kennedy, and I come to this work with about 15 years of experience working with individuals at many different levels and different systems, including child serving systems, foster care, education. I've worked with teachers, principals, superintendents, district and state leaders, and really spent the bulk of my career working with children and the providers who work with them, who are navigating these threatening systems. And so when I first was introduced to the timeline, I was working in foster care and I got an opportunity to be on a team with Mary Beccario. And I fell in love with the process. I thought it was so powerful in helping us to really reframe how we thought about serving the individual that was in foster care that I was working with. Fast forward about, I don't know, 5, 6 years later, I was reintroduced to the timeline process through a workshop that Sarah did for the agency I was working for at the time. And I was also thinking a lot about systems. I was in my doctoral program at the time and was really focusing on the school to prison pipeline and how we could dismantle that. So Sarah's workshop was so timely because I was thinking about systems as she was talking about the timeline process. And I'm thinking about how we can examine the education system using this timeline process. And so I grabbed Sarah by the ear, like, hey, we got to talk about this. Let me share my idea. And it has grown since then. And so what I'm doing now with the timeline is really helping schools look at not only what's happened nationally with the education system from a trauma informed lens, but also locally. So I'm working with School District of Philadelphia right now. And so I'm putting together a timeline for them to look at what's the history of education in Philadelphia as a way for them to understand how we got here and really put the problems that we are experiencing with disparate education outcomes into a historical context. So that's the approach that I bring and the lens that I bring to the work.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I think one of the things you're naming, and that I don't know how many of us look at all those 6 tenets from the trauma informed care tenets out of SAMHSA, but one of those being understanding historical and cultural and generational context. And that's what I really appreciate about that. It could feel like a stretch, but it really felt like it was kind of a good puzzle piece there of how do we not just look at a person, but an entire system that affects so many people, and that we're all subject to that history, even if it's not on the forefront of our consciousness all the time. So again, making the invisible visible, unpacking what's underneath what we're seeing and what we're understanding from a system or from a person, and how do we start to connect those dots together? Yeah. How would you describe, when it comes to the cohort process and the notion of embodiment, how has that practice kind of been influenced your work, or have you influenced that embodiment awareness?
Yeah, it's incredibly important for us to really embody this process like LaShonda talked about. I think in this process, it's probably been the most vulnerable that I've been with any group of colleagues, but it was a really great thing for us to be able to do that, because it's really important for us to look at the way that we show up to this process. And, we had a lot of conversations about that. And what it really boiled down to was, all of us bring our own special gifts and talents and perspectives to the work. And what's important for us is to show up authentically and to bring what we have internally that's unique to us to this work, to create a container for this work to be done in a way that is safe for everyone, that is non-judgmental, and that really helps everyone in that room feel seen and heard. I really was impacted by the immense power that facilitators have in holding that pen. And it's important for us to really approach it in a way that helps people to unfold the story in a way that feels safe for them.
Yeah, beautiful. And Maurice, I'm going to invite you to pick up that baton, because one of the quotes that is coming from you about the process is the Trauma Informed Biographical Timeline is about inviting people to be more human. Tell us who you are and what you mean by that.
Sure, thank you so much. So I am Maurice Cole. I work at the Cuyahoga County Board of Health serving the greater Cleveland area. I'm also a worker on the Ohio PrEP Personal Responsibility Education Program. I'm in District 2, so we have a 14 county area, and we are serving youth who have touched and connected with foster care and also with the justice system. So we're serving youth 14 to 24. And this cohort I was invited to participate in. And one of the things that I heard in the introduction was that we were going to be asked to lean into our better humanity, to really be open, with our clients in a service-oriented way, perhaps differently than I had ever heard before. And I thought, whoa, oh my goodness, what might this entail? And for people who have know me, and for those of y'all who've come to know me, I'm a pretty sensitive guy. I'm pretty vocal and kind of speak up. But again, making myself vulnerable in the process of hearing about people's stories and trying to sketch that out, to recognize the trauma that folks that have kind of informed their existence, but also being able to highlight and identify, to discern some of the resiliency that allowed them to sort of make it through the trauma. And in the process, as others have alluded to, I did some work myself, and I really appreciate the opportunity that has been afforded. And I think I'm a better practitioner as a result of this experience. I definitely feel affirmed in my own space, thinking about, the goals that we kind of set for ourselves, but sometimes we just, it's easy to advocate for other folks and maybe not always to take those moments for self. And so I just am so appreciative of this opportunity. And again, thinking about, we all experience life. Life comes at us all. And 2020 and 2021 have been like monstrous examples of that, in my opinion. But thinking about, again, the threads of resiliency that allow us to navigate, the waters that we travel is really what can help get us to a therapeutic place of healing and resolve at the end. And so, that's why I'm here. That's the lens from which I sort of operate. And I just appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for joining our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, Maurice. I've got some other questions about resilience and how you were able to tune your eyes and ears to resilience, when I know so much the focus can be on trauma, can be on the hardships and the toxic stress, which of course is important to unpack, so we stop blaming and shaming people for their survival strategies. But one thing we want to start doing is start noticing those bits of resilience, what's there, and how can we help build on that. Just going through the cohort process, how did your orientation shift, or did it, from how you previously did work and what you do now?
Yeah, I think, I definitely, with the Ohio PrEP program, we try and approach it from a judgment-free, shame-free experience. We don't know what we don't know, I think, generally speaking, from an academic perspective. And I feel like I was just given so many different resources to look at the commonalities and to really kind of make myself be more vulnerable to identify, or to acknowledge and to articulate the things in which I might share in common with clients who have gone through these various systems, and not in a like touchy-feely, oh my gosh, it's not about you. Like, we're, as practitioners, we're not supposed to insert ourselves into the story, but it's about leaning into that common humanity to find those common threads, and really to highlight, to affirm, to celebrate that despite these situations that folks may have endured, that they're here to tell the story at this point. And so some of the exercises that we learned along the way to invite sort of other members of the treatment circle in to have this conversation, because everyone has a role, to play, because ultimately we're trying to serve our clients as best we can. And if we are sometimes less academic and just more human in a really simplistic and authentic kind of way, then how much more can we sort of achieve, with that person's sort of treatment. So that's, I learned to highlight and to identify resilience in a way that I think sometimes, we're talking at people, and we always want to be talking with folks, but I have more skills to do so now as a result of this cohort. And that's what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, beautiful. It's almost as if we planned this, because now you're giving me a good segue over to Danae Riggs. I'm going to bring in her voice here. Danae, you've got a lot of experience, and not just facilitating timelines, but also working with folks one-on-one. That what happens after we unfold the story is we shift our lens to the trauma responsive plan, where we look at who is this person, what do they need, what's it going to take to meet that need, and who's going to take the lead. And I imagine, Danae, your name is in that category quite a bit with some folks that you support. So if you could talk to us a bit about that trauma responsive plan, what happens after the process and the importance of the follow-up. Probably a space in the cohort that we didn't dive deep enough, right? We had so many things we were talking about and learning in. But Danae, if you could speak to that, and of course, just start off by telling us who you are and what brought you to the work.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah, and everyone for inviting me. I had a moment where I had a Will Ferrell moment where I didn't know what to do with my hands, and I felt all nervous about what was happening. And I saw that recording button and I thought, why do I feel this way? I love talking about timelines and trauma responsive care. And I realized the reason I feel like I don't know what to do with my hands is because I'm so passionate about how important this tool is, and more importantly, how it connects teams and heals. And I'm pumped about any opportunity to talk about healing. And so that's why I don't know what to do with my hands, or why I feel nervous about sharing today. So anyways, all joking aside, the word that comes to mind for me about the timeline experience is also the word sacred. And my career has been fortunate and blessed to be in circles of sacredness for like 20 years. So yes, I'm getting older. I'm not the young person in the room anymore. But when I really began my career, I was a 19-year-old serving people in urban Cincinnati who were dealing with HIV and AIDS, and in the late 90s. And that was my first real introduction to what does it mean to work in humanity? What does it mean to serve people who are different than myself? And how am I one resilience different, or one resilience factor or opportunity or fork at the road different from being in that exact situation? And what has the resilience been like in my life to afford me those pivots? And so I just want to name that when I train and facilitate, I tell people, hey, guess what's powerful? We're experts of our own lived experience. Maurice named, hey, let's kind of quiet the academics and the cerebralness of talking about what we are doing, and name that we can lead and have efficacy with our hearts. And that, our brains are important. I talk about brains all day, brains and bodies, but this big organ in our body and our gut down here below, and where we feel that humanity and how it comes out in the world and with the people we serve is what I'm really fascinated in talking about. And so I just want to name that I kind of tell people I've been playing on the same team for a long time. I've worn a lot of different jerseys, and my position might look a little different, but I've really been in the business of supporting people on learning and healing journeys for 2 decades now. And that is a privilege and sacred to me. And the Trauma Informed Biographical Timeline is a tool to be used to help build that, to help promote that empathy, to help uncover what is there. And I think I dig down deep into my heritage, which is very Appalachian. I just got to go to the Smoky Mountains this past weekend and eat grits and be dirty in the mud. And hey, what it reminded me of is I'm a storyteller innately, and I love listening and harvesting for story. And the Trauma Informed Biographical Timeline is another means to harvesting story. And what's brilliant about it is that focused person gets to be an expert in the room. Even if they're on paper, they get to be an expert of their survival and their own lived experience. And we get to help harvest that as facilitators and and support folk who are interested in developing that trauma responsive plan. So when we've been able to explore that person's lived experience and name resilience, things that have carried them along and survived. I have a guy I work with who's my best friend, and he says, yeah, you think I'm this, or people think I'm this, but I've made it 42 years. And I say, yeah, dude, you have survived things that some of us cannot even fathom. And so when I think about being able to name and look at that resilience, and also look at some of the things that have been traumatic, or events, or the impact of some of those events on the brain and body, what I love is that as we leave out of that phase of the biographical timeline, we move into the plan. And I tell people, don't get intimidated by the plan. This is a 1-year work plan at shortest, and a lifetime journey at longest. And this is a matter of being able to see someone's resilience, highlight it, foster resilience as we think about belonging and what brings people joy and what do they need to heal. And when we write up there, what does this person need? They need love. They need hugs. They need validation. They need reassurance. They need safe faces and opportunities to belong where they matter, where their role in our society and in our civility matters. And then we take that plan and we run with it. And we figure out who can do this, who can hold this kind of space, who can invite and connect and model and nurture. And that, well, it makes me start sweating, and I don't know what to do with my hands, because it just excites me about what kind of impact. And we can call those things interventions, strategies, outcomes, deliverables. We can academic it, right? But the real nitty gritty is, it's what are we doing? So what? Why does it matter? And how are we going to? And who can? And how can we build those partnerships to do that? And that's the stuff that gets me excited. So I'm back to, in many ways, that direct service 19-year-old driving around in the car in a familiar or unfamiliar neighborhood, looking for people and making connections. I'm just doing it differently at 42 than I was at 19, with a little bit more experience under my belt. Sometimes that curiosity, though, and naivete is still what helps me be effective. And so that plan is where teams really get to come together and say, all right, now how do we start a healing journey? How do we look at this situation or this human and their lived experiences and enhance and pour into? And yeah, that's exciting work.
It is exciting work, and to see you in action is also a treat. Danae, you're telling us you're 42, but we can still feel that 19-year-old energy, which is always exciting.
Good.
And yeah, it is good. What I'm hearing from you too, I've got a couple different brains on right now, but what I'm hearing is awesome. You get to spend this one-on-one time. You get to get out there and do these things and connect and find people. And then I'm hearing the education system that says, we don't have any time. How are we going to do this, right? So one of the things we got to focus on, and what it was a pivot, was an invitation from some of our educators in the group that said, hey, can we have some special time here to talk about how does this framework, how does this work within this system here? And Dr. Kennedy, I would love if you could name not only some things maybe we talked about, but let's put out the dream. What might be possible, whether or not we've had that experience yet? Maybe plant some seeds of how we could think about this differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with using the timeline in the educational setting, it has the potential to be a very powerful tool. Like I said in the beginning, using it first as a tool to help the adults in school systems get more of a historical context to understand what some of the history around some of the issues that we are dealing with, where they come from. What I've learned in my experience is very often educators come to the classroom without a lot of that historical context. And so that can play into some implicit biases or confirm implicit biases that people come to the work with, because they may just think, well, these kids are acting this way because they don't care about education, or their family doesn't care, without really understanding some of the systems and structures that have been in place for a very long time that have lended to these outcomes. And it's very important for our educators to have that understanding. I also think that it's important, and that the potential is there for the timeline to really support the adults in the schools in their own social and emotional development as well. There's a lot of reflecting that happens with the timeline. So you'll be challenged definitely with information that you didn't know, not only traumatic experiences, but also resilience factors. You'll uncover what are some of the resilience factors of some of the students that may be different from you. And what's the history of some of the resilience factors that have developed over time. So I think there's a lot of great potential there. In addition to helping educators get a clearer view of what's happening with students. You know, we talked about in our group, of course, the time constraint that many educators are facing. It's hard to get a bunch of educators in the room for 3 hours to talk about one kid. That's a very hard thing to pull off. So some of the things that we talked about was how you could maybe look at a group of students, a cohort of students, or a neighborhood, and what may be happening in that local context that you can examine and still get to that same plan like Danae was talking about. What are we going to do? What do they need? Who's going to do it? You can still do that with multiple kids, with a cohort of kids, and get to those same kind of outcomes. So I think there's, again, a lot of potential within education for them to use this timeline. Pre or post-COVID now, we can say, well, what have all of our students in general experienced this last school year? What happened in 2020? What were some of the losses? What were some of the things that helped sustain our students? And then go right into the planning. So there's so much that can be done in the education setting with the timeline. I think it's just important for us to think outside of the box and really craft it into what we need it to be to make it work in that education context.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And I think that's one of the things we want to name to be prescriptive, right? To be transactional versus relational, or procedural versus relational. If that's our orientation, we've lost kind of one of the main purposes or the rootedness of the timeline. It's about changing the stories we tell, and impacting the stories that we hear about a person. One thing we got to talk a bit more specifically about was the notion of FBAs, or functional behavior assessments, that those are so quick to be done in the education system. However, they're built to observe what's observable, what you can see, and what we know about trauma, traumatic imprints, right? Or intergenerational experiences. All this stuff is what you can't see, but it shows up in our behavioral patterns, right? So another reason why the timeline process and facilitating that can be really helpful in getting more of a whole picture of a young person. And we could go in on that education conversation, but I just wanted to kind of plant those seeds, and I'm going to bring it over to Shanda here in a moment. But for anyone out there, if you have specific questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and I'll direct them to the panel. What I'd love to do, Shanda, I want to bring you into the conversation in a very kind of specific way. You have a couple lenses that you were offering to our cohort that was kind of outside of how we were traditionally engaging folks. We had a full day this time, right, instead of half days, and so we were able to bring in more content and relational experiences. But how does understanding racism, white supremacy culture, why talk about these things? How do these things show up and impact the work that we're doing? And that's really broad, so you take it where you want to go here, but I wanted to bring you in for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So if we're saying that essentially the premise, the heart, the spirit of the timeline is to understand what went into a person and the resulting beliefs and worldviews and behavioral patterns and survival strategies that emerged, we can't have that conversation in the United States of America without talking about the impact of racism, white body supremacy, white supremacy culture, oppression of all kinds, because those are things that go into a person. You know, going back to what Dr. Kennedy was saying, when I met Dr. Kennedy, it's because I was invited to a timeline she did on the education system in America. And just being like overwhelmed with like, I had to shut up because we had to like, let's keep going. But it's like, let's just start here. Like, when we think about our education system, when we think about our service provision systems, they're based in policy, they're based in law, they're based in all of these rules. Okay, fine, but where did they come from? How did you come to think what you think about that person? That person, the greater context of that person is geographically where they're from. It is the color skin that you perceive. It is all of these things that form together to come and create a narrative. And the thing about it is, our brains make up stories all the time, every single day, all day long. Things you think you know, I mean, you might know them, but it don't make it fact. It just means your brain made it up. And we, as a very cognitive culture, learn to go, oh, that must be truth. So when we are in a position to interact and engage with other humans, we are more frequently engaging with the story our brain has made up about them than actually who they are. And that goes either way. You can see a person and they can be smiling and have big bright eyes and have a non-threatening disposition, and your brain will make up they're safe. So we start talking about how do we present safely to people, because in essence, what we want their brains to do is make up the story that we're safe enough to engage with. It's important that we start talking about things like white body supremacy and the fact that it's in the water, it's in the air, it is part of the institution of this country. We gotta stop having that conversation. We have to stop having conversations like, I don't have bias. So there are only two rules to bias. Do you breathe air and do you poop? And if you answered yes to either one of those questions, you have bias. Let's move past that part of the conversation because it's a human survival thing. Once we can get past some of these basement conversations, we can ride the elevator up a floor and we can say, what can I do? What do I need to know? What do I do here first? So we talk about this in the context of the timeline, because this narrative that I can't be racist or have racist ideals or have oppressive behaviors because I'm a good person starts to fading away. And we get to start talking about the things that are actual reality in the lives of so many marginalized people, whether they're young people, whether they're, it doesn't matter their age, doesn't matter in what context. That's important. It's also important that in this timeline, we may be focusing on one person, but you might be in a room, virtual or in person, with numerous other people who are also being impacted by oppression of all kinds. And if we don't begin to make this an intuitive understanding, and we don't begin to practice sitting with the weight of that, allowing our bodies to metabolize what that means, and developing practices to help us be able to name what is, to be real about what's real, then every time we think we're helping someone, we could be harming them and we don't know it. We got to get real with the things that are real. And that's what I appreciate about overlaying the timeline onto the reality of so many people and their lived experiences. That yes, the timeline often starts with utero, but that we're developing the capacity to hold the intergenerational and historical trauma that's living in the bodies of every single person that's present. And in that practice, in that development, it's just like anything else, we're building a muscle, right? You don't have to come with it developed, but you got to come knowing that it's part of the weights that we're going to do. Don't skip leg day. You know how they say that? Like, just don't skip leg day. They carry your whole body around. Don't skip leg day. We can't skip this either, because it's going to be what carries us forward.
If anyone has been with LaShonda for more than 10 minutes, you know she's the metaphor queen. So glad you brought in a couple there. And I want to pull out a tiny thread. And if any of their panel members want to jump in, you can. But I want to pull out a thread, this notion of all bodies. And I don't mean all lives matter conversation. I mean our human bodies, all bodies carry stress, trauma, and resilience, right? But there's a group of bodies I want to talk about, and I want to toss it over to you here, Maurice. There's a question coming in: can this framework, can this lens be used in prisons or in the justice system with corrections officers to look at the trauma that they hold, that they too hold these traumatic experiences, not just the folks who are, in the prison system, which we can talk about how we got there in the first place, but the folks who are working in these systems, when there's a kind of a culture of, or could be a culture of kind of a male-dominated culture, or even a machismo culture, how do we penetrate that? How do we access and open up these conversations to groups of people who may not be invited into that vulnerability or that awareness all the time?
Sure. I think we create the space, right? And then we invite those people in to the experience, and then we hold that. So I would say, a training opportunity might be a mechanism to do that with Soulbird Consulting. We've got Sarah Buffie here. We've got LaShonda at Labors of Love, just saying shout outs. But, because the Ohio Prep program is administered by the Ohio Department of Youth Services, we are going to have an opportunity to serve some of our, juvenile justice youth in this capacity as we train other people to, sort of create these trauma-informed biological timelines. And so I would think that we're really only bound by the limits of our systems, and sometimes we have to sort of propel those systems to dream a little bit. And so I think there's a mechanism to do that. But again, speaking from my own experience, I felt very affirmed in the work that we did, that also helps me to be a more deliberate practitioner. And again, being able to kind of identify resilience and how that informs all of our experience, despite the trauma that any of us can endure, because trauma sometimes is a part of the human experience, or perhaps is a part of the human experience for so many of us. Maybe I'll say it that way. And so, yeah, I think we're only bound by, our system being able to create that space and inviting people in and then holding it. So we've got some great resources for sort of future trainings here. Maybe that's a conversation that you all could have offsite, and I'll make my information available too if there's a way to kind of dream that out a little further and see exactly what that might look like for you. Thanks.
Awesome. And I love that. I love that too, talking about when we can notice the barriers in our system, that doesn't have to get us down, but can kind of show us a little bit what we're up against and how can we maneuver, how can we navigate. A colleague, Brandon Black, named recently in a session, a meeting, that the systems are a set of decisions which are made by us human beings, us people, right? So we have capacity to shift and to maneuver within those and around those. And Danae, I'd love to hear a little bit from you. How have you, if we just keep our clinical cap, our system cap on, we're gonna be kind of locked in sometimes. What can you help us understand, what does it mean to lift your gaze and use your citizen cap as you're connecting with folks and trying to build on the resilience or grow resilience after that timeline process?
Well, I think I want to share a LaShonda quote that came out of my participation of the cohort, because I think so often when I even talk about what I do for a living, people hear wah, 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 or I can't, or they immediately say, well, that's not me. She's not talking about me. And so I want to name that one of the things that LaShonda helped shape for me in the cohort participation was the construct of what is trauma, and being able to help me understand that that has become a buzzword. So in my early parts of my career, diversity became a buzzword, and I started to resent the use of it because it got so overplayed. Trauma for me is starting to shape that way. This is very personal. I'm not shaming or blaming anybody else, but that word choice for me. And so when I am really trying to be mindful of helping people not do that immediate separation of them and us, I need this, but he needs this, or he couldn't possibly need this because he's this. I take it to naming toxic stress. Hello, raise your hand if you've ever been, I'm stressed out. Or in my Southern culture, we call it fit to be tied, or she's having a nervous breakdown, right? When we hear those things, what I'm talking about is toxic stress, and the difference being prolonged, or what I loved about the quote that LaShonda gave me was trauma. I have this up in my office now. Trauma is the beliefs, worldviews, and behavioral patterns that emerge from traumatic events. So when people are naming, well, I don't think that ever happened to him, or what did happen to him, right? Like that we can talk about it in a bigger construct about how it shapes our worldview and how it shapes our behavioral pattern. That leads me into your question, which is, if we stop perpetuating the them and us, and we start thinking about what does this person need to feel confident? Well, guess what? We can easily go and think, what did I do as a small child in my development, or at any point in my development and journey, at a 42-year-old development? What have I been exposed to? What opportunities have I had? What's my abundance of experience versus a poverty of experience that has given me this outlet for building confidence? Well, for me, I can name a million things as a little child because I had privilege and access, and someone gave a two shits about me, right? So I was able, sorry, I'm a cusser. So I was able to do things like Girl Scouts, or joining a ballet class, or whatever belonging that I was exposed to that gave me access to building some of those characteristics, right? So when we are wondering how did we get here? When we think about the prison system, when we think about any of these systems, let's look at what experiences can we now put into that person's life? Can we invite them? Can we connect them into that help to build that, to reaffirm that, and that it's never too late for that to happen? So yes, I'm not going to enroll my 42-year-old friend in Girl Scouts, but what does he love? What lifts him up? And start at that baseline. You know, I labeled recently in a Facebook post about an experience I had with this friend, that how do all friendships start? They start with common interests. So with this particular friend, we like biscuits and gravy. We like overalls. We like nature. You know, and I named these things that were very easy for me to say, I don't have to fake this. I love, who doesn't love biscuits and gravy? We can start a biscuits and gravy club. I'm fat and love to eat. Let's go to breakfast. Let's invite other people to go to breakfast. Let's let everybody eat biscuits and gravy, and start with something to build belonging. Well, in the meantime, as we're building that sense of belonging, which is lending itself to voice and choice and agency and self-efficacy and feeling that I matter in the world, right? All those things that are growing and increasing meant that some of those challenging behavioral patterns were decreasing. And we're watching that ebb and flow balance that really came from a Google search about my zip code, and then figuring out, what do two people that love biscuits and gravy do with other people that love biscuits and gravy? So it can be so simple that we overlook it, and that really is resilience. And what's phenomenal for my brothers and sisters in this work around when we're burnout, or we don't have anything to give, or we're surviving a pandemic, we are not different. So I'm full of toxic stress, is that what I heard was vicarious trauma, vicarious trauma, vicarious trauma. Come to a seminar to learn about vicarious trauma. But what no one was telling me is, do this work with people and build vicarious resilience. So the healing journey that I went on in the last 2.5, 3 years is what prepared me for a pandemic. It's what prepared me every day to watch more Black bodies being murdered. It's what prepared me for losing my own health for 3 months to COVID, right? Like it's those things that help to build and saturate me with vicarious resilience, not vicarious trauma, to persevere. And I think we don't talk about that enough. And we don't dangle that carrot in front of our providers and name that this shaping and reframing is also an invitation for us to be sustainable in our careers.
Yeah, beautiful, Danae. And I want to uplift Ilea Duggar, who coined that term, vicarious resilience, as a peer support with our resilience project. Again, like Danae said, realize that this is us work. It's not them over there, right? And I think when we get to us work, when we get to human work, there's an element that we don't talk a lot about in our systems and in our work because it feels a little too personal. And it's the notion of feeling. Dr. Kennedy, what does that speak to you? And would you be willing to share some thoughts on the notion of feelings?
Yeah, absolutely. In this process, going through this cohort, it was really important for us to feel our way through this process. And like I said before, this was definitely the most vulnerable that I have been and experienced among a group of my colleagues, but it was important because too often in our society, we are divorced from our feelings. And, we're told not to trust our feelings, that they're a form of weakness, and that we need to put them on the shelf, especially when it's time for us to go to work. So this practice of not welcoming our feelings and not embracing them really is part of what upholds these systems of oppression that we talked about. And so if we want to disrupt them, we have to not cut ourselves off from what it means to be fully human. And that means we have to be able to feel. And so by accepting and dealing with our feelings, we really are unlocking a pathway to justice, to equity, and to liberation, which is what we want for ourselves, and certainly is what we want for the people that we're facilitating the timeline for. So this cohort was a great place for us all to identify, to learn from, and to express our feelings without judgment. And because of it, we're not only more equipped to respond to the uncomfortable feelings or unpleasant feelings that might surface as we facilitate timelines, but we're also more capable of being responsive to the pleasant emotions and the resilience that emerges through that process as well.
I'm not going to babble any further. That lands the plane, y'all. That was the fastest hour I think I've experienced. And so I want to thank you, Dr. Kennedy, LaShonda Sugg, Maurice Cole, and Danae Riggs. I see Joni and Tekka and Sam and other folks out here who are in our cohort as well. So just want to thank everybody, our panel specifically, for bringing your heart and your wisdom today. We have a couple more minutes, so if there are any burning questions or just kudos, if you want to shout somebody out, this is the time for the audience to open up and use your voice a little bit with our last couple minutes. Otherwise, really appreciate everyone's time today, and we'll look forward to engaging out there in the ether. So, yes, you're welcome, Tammy. I think we got some claps there. Beautiful. All right, Shanda, any last words?
You should do it. If you haven't done it already, you should. You'll thank yourself there, and I think I don't know if this has been explicitly stated, but it's nice to know what you're getting yourself into, but keep your eyes open for opportunities to be a part of this. I think something we also didn't get to communicate as much is how it's also about community building. We came together in this cohort, not as individual peoples in different parts of the state, but we came together and we formed a community of people who were growing and developing at the same time. Sarah, Dr. Kennedy, and I as facilitators didn't come like, oh, we know it and y'all don't. No, we were sitting shoulder to shoulder with everyone in the cohort, and it's all about building community, a sense of belonging, and fostering healing for ourselves as well. So if you have the opportunity to participate, it comes highly recommended because, you know, it's a group of awesome people out there who get to connect.
Beautiful.
Hey,
Great.
can I give some kudos real quick before you guys end?
Please, go ahead.
Okay.
Hi,
It says my name is Nyla. My name is actually not Nyla. That's my daughter. I'm Jordan. I'm actually Maurice's niece. Hello.
Yay!
I just want to give you guys kudos. That was awesome and amazing to hear. I'm a registered nurse and I live here in Indianapolis, and it just makes me think about, you know, all the work that still needs to be done in the healthcare system. Just working with the patients that we interact with, and how beneficial this would be as a foundation of training for us. Just because there's just so much loss in care. There's so many drops in care, and a lot of it is really probably stems from our trauma that we all experience. So you guys are doing a wonderful work, and I appreciate all that you're doing. It was very informative, and thank you for sharing.
Awesome. Thanks for chiming in, Jordan, and seeing your uncle here. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Beautiful. You know, I could be with every one of you for the rest of the day, but I do want to be mindful of folks' time and energy. And so I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the Resilience Project. And like Shanda said, keep your eyes peeled for the 4th annual cohort that will be coming up towards the end of this year. And we'll look forward to seeing y'all out in this good heart work that we're all so passionate about. Enjoy the rest of your day, y'all.